Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought I might share a few of my current favorite tarot decks, specifically ones that fall into a category that I have self-titled Figureless Tarot Decks, and I want to use these decks to talk about the category and idea of figureless tarot decks, the pros and cons of working with decks that lack figures and what that really means. Also, I think this is a category of deck that is underrated and underloved. I don't see as many of these out on the market or decks created in this way, and I'd love to see more of them. I'd also love to get more opinions and also maybe take away a bit of the intimidation factor that I know can easily arise when you look at a card and there isn't some sort of character or figure doing something or expressing something to start your interpretation or base an interpretation off of. So I have 5 decks here. These would be 5 examples of figureless tarot decks in my opinion, and ones that I personally love, enjoy, and use quite often. I'm going to use them as a way to also define this category and then to maybe express a bit of why I like them, what they bring to the table, and then how I use them. So the first one that I'm going to share is going to be the Ad Orbita Tarot. This is by Nicole Rallis and Peter Henry Reed. Comes in this nice hard box, which I appreciate. I believe this creator also made the Pythia Oracle and the Ophidia Rosa Tarot, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Both of which didn't really appeal to me, funny enough, but this one did. I think it's the astronomy and astrology that's woven into the more herbal, plant-based aspect of the deck. When something's completely plant-based, as far as decks go, and nature-based decks that are very plant-heavy, I tend to shy away just because that's not what a lot of my practice is made up of. I'm not great with the correspondences that relate to plants, so this one has enough going on in terms of astronomy and astrology for me to make sense of that. I do know a bit more about those sorts of things, so this just made a little bit more sense for me. Now, what makes this a figureless tarot deck, although, for example, you may see these snakes or these Ouroboros-looking things, a lot of the cards feature a plant or a planet of some sort pretty heavily. None of these are animated or personified, and that's what makes a figureless tarot deck so... I would say that's a distinguishing factor. So you could have a nature-based deck, for example, that does have figures. If there's, for example, a squirrel or an octopus, something front and center that appears to be doing something or quite expressive in its nature, I think it then starts to fall into the figure tarot deck category. Whereas all of the plants, the few animals that we see, the planets and sort of celestial events happening are more about the scene that's being created, the cycle that we're viewing as readers, rather than there being some action, some character, some animated thing going on. And that's how this specific nature-based deck, and I guess I would consider this a nature-based deck, does fall into the figureless category, whereas a lot of animal-based decks, I find, don't fall into this category because they are, in their own right, figures, even though they are animals. They're animated, they have some sort of facial expression, your eye goes to them, and it starts with the interpretation based on what you imagine they're doing or feeling or trying to communicate to you, rather than transposing yourself into a scene like you might in these. And that's really what I think figureless tarot decks are all about, removing the idea of something in the card having a selfhood and using your own reading abilities, being able to project yourself or others and your own feelings into a scene or into what the card has to offer. Not all figureless tarot decks are scenic though, and I am going to get to that. I do have some abstract examples that I think illustrate the figureless category in a different light. I would say this one works well for those who might be a little bit intimidated by the idea of figureless tarot decks, because you do get the flora, the fauna, the astronomy, the astrology, the numerology is pretty prevalent, so I think a lot of people who are new to the idea of figureless tarot decks could still get along quite well with this. Not to mention that the guidebook or the guide pamphlet is pretty descriptive of what's going on. It will let you know usually what plant is apparent in the card, for what reason, what event or celestial event is occurring, what planet or asteroid is being featured, all in ways that I think you can use to weave correspondences into your readings. Another great example of a figureless tarot deck that falls more into that scenic category, a bit like the Ad Orbita, is going to be the Tildwick tarot deck, for the Tildwick Tarot. This one many may be familiar with. Very literally just features rooms or scenes. So you may be in a garden, you might be in a sitting room or a dining room, and really it's about populating what you're looking at with your own emotions, your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own ideas of selfhood. You could put people, for example, you could imagine different people and circumstances that you might be drawing cards about in these different scenes, and they do still communicate this sort of mood or tone. We have some rooms that look quite happy, others that look wistful and nostalgic. Some look upkept and like somebody's just walked out of the room and might return at a moment's notice. Others look abandoned and disheveled. And I think that this deck has this sort of whimsical, worldly feel, and we have to be then the characters that populate or get written into the story that is this deck. And that's really why I think I enjoy it. One of the big pros to figureless tarot decks, in my opinion, is that you're not directed in a given, I wouldn't say you're not boxed in nearly as much. And some people don't feel boxed in by figure tarot decks, but hear me out just on the fact that when you see a character that has a facial expression or seems to be conducting some sort of action, the interpretation is sort of intrinsically or subconsciously tied to what it is that you're seeing, even if you choose to diverge from what the character's doing and interpret the card much differently than what you see going on in the card. I do think that your mind needs to start with what you're seeing and then jump off from that. I'd rather cut out the middleman and not have somebody that is in the card for me to then have to, segue into a different type of interpretation. I also like, for example, when I'm reading for somebody else or a client and there isn't necessarily something happening on the card. I think there is confusion, for example, in something like the Rider-Waite-Smith when you pull the Five of Wands and you see people that seem to be sparring or fighting, and if I were to then interpret it very differently from what we're looking at there, the person might furrow their brow, and I've had this happen, and ask questions about why what I have to say about the card is so different than what appears to be in the image, and it just, to me, that's so needless. I'd rather have a deck that can go in a lot of different directions, that's not going to inherently hold a sort of feeling or tone or idea without me being the one to ascribe that feeling or tone or action to the card, if that makes sense. I know it's a bit of a weird way to say it, and I probably could have simplified it or said it more clearly, but that's really why, and part of why I love figureless tarot decks and where I see the benefits the most. Now I have the Orbifold Tarot. This would be an example of a non-scenic figureless tarot deck, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a scene that you can project yourself into to fall within this category. So not all figureless tarot decks are scenic, not all scenic decks are figureless tarot decks, not all nature-based or animal-based decks are figureless tarot decks, but they can be. Kind of like how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. So we've got the Orbifold. This one's going to be more abstract. This one really plays on the idea of the elements and the numerology, things that I can personally get behind very easily and enjoy. They remind me of mandalas. It's quite energetic. You start to see on the table the way that colors flow into each other, the way that things seem to separate and come together. To me, this is almost like this primordial energy that comes before manifest creation. It's like you're reading energy with this deck, and I think I have a video about reading energy with the cards, and I think that this kind of deck, these abstract type decks that are figureless, lend themselves really well to that. Another benefit, and I think this is a good example of the pro that comes with some figureless decks, is that there's less confusion when you have a larger spread on the table. I think when I see something like the Rider-Waite-Smith or even the Thoth, which I happen to love, on a table and there's more than, say, 3 cards, I have to look to see what's happening in each of the cards, and it's a lot to break down, and it's harder to see the reading or the spread itself as a whole. I have to then look at the action that's occurring, the characters that are present, and what's happening here, what's happening here, what's happening over there, versus something like this. I could have a bunch of cards on the table, and I can they can bleed together. I can read them as this sort of tonal quality where I'm noticing greens that fade into reds. I'm not focused on a person over there that appears to be in love and another person on the left who appears to be fighting and the angel at the upper part. I can read all of these together as a unit, as a unified whole, versus figure-based tarot decks, which are more independent in the card-by-card reading, if you ask me. It's not to say that a larger spread works better or worse with figureless tarot decks, but I do think it's easier for me to look at the spread as a whole with figureless tarot decks and pick up on the bigger picture or larger themes at play to read the cards in connection to one another, as opposed to figure tarot decks where my first inclination and instinct is to look at all of them individually and then read them in that way, and then try to find the connections afterwards. So yeah, that's the Orbifold, one of my definite favorites and one that I do like for very big spreads because of that fact. Another one that I would put in the same camp as the Orbifold is Itho Cocoon's, I definitely butchered that name, Tarot is Color. I've seen this one out and about and around on TarotTube quite a bit lately, so I do know that this, as far as figureless tarot decks go, is a current favorite for many. This is, again, very prominent in that sort of abstract, focuses on the color and just the feeling that these abstract, very simple, colorful, color-based images communicate. I do think that on a table, looking at this, just like you can with a lot of figureless tarot decks, specifically the Orbifold, you can sort of watch them bleed into each other. You can get a sense of cooler tones over here versus warmer tones over there in the past. Things like that. These very intuitive, grand scale, bigger picture type readings, I find tend to work really well with this. I do think that there is an inherent level of intuition that is more at the forefront of reading with figureless tarot decks. It's very easy to get analytical when you're looking at a character that you can relate to an action or a person that you might know or have seen in real life. You're automatically using your own memories and experiences as your basis, versus something like this where I think the intuition, it's more directly tapped into, and it's at the forefront of readings like this. Because I don't have a chance to think about a person, place, or thing that I can relate to begin reading. I have to just think of the feeling I get from the color. Does it make me feel sad, happy, excited, etc.? Okay, and then I have one more to share in this category, and this one I would say is a hybrid, in my opinion, of the more scenic, nature-based figureless decks and the more abstract, colorful, almost energetic decks that I just featured. And this is the Starlight Dragon Tarot by, I believe, is it Nora Huska and Steph Engert? I believe those are the artists' names, if I'm not mistaken. Let me make sure I get cards out. These remind me a lot of mandalas, actually, as well. They are sharp squares, so I think they look really good in creating sort of like grids and patterns. You can see, for example, the elements and attributions in the corners, which I think is very helpful. A lot of them do feature these sorts of dragons, and although one could say that this is more of a character, I don't think it's personified or animated in a way that leads me to pick up on a certain feeling or action. They're very much part of the energy, and it's almost like the energy's manifesting as a dragon, but the dragon itself is not necessarily conscious in the way that I would imagine sentience to work. I don't know if that makes sense. But for example, this one has more so just eyes that are there rather than a very prominent dragon. This one, a lot of the minors don't even feature dragons really. And then you'll see them in majors and court cards. And if you do see dragon-like beings in the minors, they're usually more abstract and they haven't really coalesced into anything corporeal or tangible. This reminds me of like an astral realm. If I were to call this deck a place or a type of way of seeing things, it's almost just very fluid. There's a sort of formlessness or a almost like capricious nature to the idea of form in this deck. Like it's ever changing, it's fluid, it's adapting to thoughts, feelings, and ideas. And personally, it's one of my favorites. I think it looks really wonderful in the same way that the Orbifold and the Tarot as color look on a table. And I like the angular nature of this, how I can almost create a grid, whether I create or lay out 4 of these and create a larger square comprised of 4 squares. Things like that I think look wonderful and lend itself to these bigger picture readings. Like I said, I do think that for very real world scenarios, that for practical matters, tarot decks that feature figures sometimes might be the way to go. I do think that there is something to them, and I'm not here to bash them or say that figureless tarot decks are better than figure tarot decks. In fact, I use both, I love both, but I do find that I gravitate towards, very often at least, figureless tarot decks, and there aren't too many out there. I do find that they're a type of deck, a category of deck that most people don't gravitate towards, or at least it's sort of hit or miss for a lot of people, I would say. And then when it does come to the figured tarot decks, I love ones that sort of skirt the edge of what I would imagine a figured tarot deck to be like. The Thoth would probably be my all-time favorite deck. And some cards, for example, like the Minors, to me are very much figureless. Figureless cards, they make up a figureless portion of this deck. And then when we do get these figures, they are not, even though they might have a personality to them, they don't look like anybody that I could ever encounter in the human world, which I appreciate. But to each their own. I would love to know what you all think of figureless tarot decks. If there are any really wonderful ones out there that you would recommend or that you personally enjoy. I'm always looking for recommendations. Yeah, just let me know what you think about this topic, this category, if anybody wants to make a response. I'm not sure if I'll have like a hashtag around or anything, but feel free to, and then let me know if you do. Like and subscribe if this was fun and interesting, and until next time, bye.